Good morning. My name is John Miko. I am the Executive Director of the Foundations of the Union League. And on behalf of the 3,300 members of the Union League and the 3 charitable foundations that they support, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Giving USA's 2012 report on philanthropy. Did anyone see the Philadelphia Inquirer today? Yes. Okay, I just want to make sure you know that you're in the right spot. Because if you saw the Inquirer today, you saw there was a great article not only about this report that you're about to hear, but you also, on the other side, there was an article about the Union League of Philadelphia and about one of the foundations that I'm honored and privileged to run, the Abraham Lincoln Foundation. And I wanted to just give you, in 30 seconds, a little bit of information on that and hopefully follow up with that. You are in one of the great locations and historic spots in Philadelphia. And that article was about some of the great history here, specifically United States Colored Troops, and the role that the Union League played with the United States Colored Troops in the Civil War. And if you want to know more, and I hope you do, come downstairs 2 floors right below you to the Heritage Center, which is the home to these 3 foundations, and you'll learn lots more about this great history. You'll learn more about Gettysburg, and you'll see some of the most incredible artifacts anywhere. Gettysburg doesn't have this stuff. So please, afterwards, if you have a few moments, please just come downstairs and learn more about what we do here at the Union League with our foundations, but also more about your history, the Philadelphia history and the Civil War. Today, in addition to the Union League and to the foundations of the Union League, we have our other co-sponsors, and I'd like to thank them, Eileen Heisman and National Philanthropic Trust. Thank you, Eileen. Bob Evans and EHL Consulting. Bob, thank you. And of course, the best software that fundraising could possibly have, Donor Perfect. Thank you, Donor Perfect. We're going to hear today from a number of people about kind of the big picture stuff. And Patrick Rooney is going to be speaking to you in a moment about some of these really interesting trends, and we're going to hear about policy issues, some scary things coming from Washington, perhaps, about the deduction and things like that. And today is really a day I look forward to kind of step back and, we're all in the trenches a lot, at least us, those of us who are in the philanthropic world, raising money day to day, but to get a big picture and to get some context for that, I think is really important. And Patrick Rooney is certainly a guy who gets that and can do that in spades. He's a guy who knows the numbers, knows the trends, and he's the expert. And I really look forward to hearing from all of you. And Patrick, I think you're up. Thank you.
Big stuff. All right. Thanks, John. I consider myself a competitive person in lots of ways, but I never knew that historians were also competitive. I've never been anywhere where someone said, Gettysburg doesn't have that, so fascinating. Well, this is the annual yearbook on philanthropy produced by Giving USA Foundation, and this is, I think, the 13th year that the first Center on Philanthropy, now the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, has collaborated with the Giving USA Foundation and the Giving Institute members to produce Giving USA. And so we're very excited about this partnership, and I am going to go a little time on each slide, in part because we have a panel, and in part because we want to save time for Q&A. So I'm going to go a little fast, and I hope you don't mind. So hopefully this works. I'm going to skip the stuff about the sponsors and get into, I'm in a do loop here.
Technical difficulties. It needs to go to the other presentation. Alt tab.
Thank you. I probably could have done that, but that's safer. Giving USA has been doing this annual yearbook since 1956, and we're going to talk about some of the year-to-year changes, but also some of the longer-term trends. And this is, not to brag too much, but this is the only annual report that looks at all the sources and all the uses of philanthropy simultaneously, and it's the longest-running data series on this as well. Speaking of the longest-running data series, the answer of the year is $316.23 billion. Okay, that's the big number. And I think this is an important number because it's not only because it's so big, but it's growing. So the good news is that philanthropy grew last year, grew 3.5% in nominal terms, 1.5% in inflation-adjusted dollars. And you can see from this histogram that philanthropy moves with the business cycle, that during most downturns, giving slows or declines. But during the Great Recession, there was a very precipitous decline. The total giving fell over 15% in inflation-adjusted dollars. And we're seeing a bit of a return. Just like the rest of the economy, it's growing relatively slowly. So we want to be optimistic. The glass half full part of the story is that giving is growing. It's no longer declining, and 3 years in a row of growth, which is great, 3 or more years in a row of $300 billion or more in total giving from all sources. And at the same time, we do need to keep in mind that 3 years out from the recession, from the Great Recession, we are still not back to where we were before the Great Recession began. In fact, we estimated that if giving continued to grow at the same rates that it has the last 2 years, it would take another 6 or 7 years just to get back to the status quo ante. So we've got some work to do, and I think that the real issue is not so much because of that number, but because that means that there are fewer people being served, fewer people being fed, fewer people being housed, fewer people being educated and trained. And so I think that's a challenge for the nonprofit sector. I think another challenge is that total giving as a percentage of total GDP has been stuck at 2%. It's been stuck at exactly 2% for the last several years, but even going back over the last 40 years, it has ranged in a fairly narrow bandwidth between 1.7 and 2.2%. I think one of the questions the nonprofit sector has to ask is, what's the value-added proposition that it would take to move that from 2% to 4 or 5? Or think about the biblical tithe of 10%. Now, I'm an empiricist, and I'm not going to say the Bible is the authority on how much people should give from an empirical perspective, but it's a benchmark that we all know about, right? And what we see is that on average, as a society, we're vastly underperforming compared to that benchmark. One of the things that we see, one of the things that we found is that the single biggest predictor of changes in both foundation grant making and changes in household giving is changes in the S&P 500. Okay? It is not to say that people give just because their stock portfolio is greater. That's not why they're giving. They're giving for a lot of reasons, right? But how much they give does vary by their wealth and their perception of wealth and their perception of where the economy is going. And so what we found is this very nifty relationship. Now, thankfully, the stock, the S&P 500 in 2012 dollars is in the gold, yellowish bar, and total giving is in the blue line. Thankfully, giving is not as volatile as the S&P 500. Can you imagine budgeting and planning for a charity if your income streams looked like that? That'd be tough. But at the same time, there is a strong correlation between the two, and so we think that's an important variable to follow. Well, here's the famous pie chart that if you download the executive summary will be available for free as a part of the Giving USA reports, and Bob will maybe talk more about that at the end. But I think one of the fascinating things, of that $316.23 billion, 72% came from living individuals. Another 7% came from people who had recently passed through their charitable bequests, and 15% came from foundations. Now, another 6% came from corporations. If you go back, though, and take the inter vivos giving, the bequest giving, and the fact that 45% of the foundation grant making comes from family foundations in which the family members are still making decisions. You add that up, and that's 86 or 87% of total giving in any given year is coming from individuals through one checkbook or another, right? So when we think about it from a charity's perspective, from a fundraiser's perspective, it shows the very important power of relationships and the importance of individuals and families as donors. I said earlier, total giving increased 3.5% from 2011. And if you look at these percentages, I think one of the things that we'll see in another slide is that the foundation grant making is 15% of the total pie now. That has been the fastest growing piece of the pie. The individual share has declined over the last several decades, but part of this is because people of wealth are creating family foundations and they're giving through a different checkbook. So it's not that individuals have reduced their commitment to philanthropy. I think it's important not to take that conclusion as we see that their share has declined, but that rather they're giving another way. Well, we talk a lot about how things changed from last year to this year, but we also want to take a little bit longer view and look at 2 years. And in the last 2 years, total giving increased 7.9% in nominal dollars. And again, glass half full says, hey, that's great. A, giving wasn't going down, and B, that's a non-trivial increase, right? The glass half empty piece is that giving increased 1.5% in inflation-adjusted dollars last year and 1% the year before. So again, charities are facing increased demand for services at the same time that their growth in philanthropic support is relatively slow. And you can look at what's been going on between the individuals has been growing the slowest, other than when you look at both individual giving and bequest giving. The bequest giving is a little odd, and we're going to talk more about that later, but you had this big growth from 2010 to 2011, largely driven by one large charitable bequest. One estate left $2.5 billion or more to a family foundation. Well, that bumped up giving by bequest by almost 10%. You take that back out, and bequest giving falls by 10%, and it was tempered a little bit by other things, so bequest giving decreased by 7%, but it's really more of a return to the norm. We'll go through the different sources of giving in a little more detail very briefly. If you look at household giving, or giving by individuals and their families, you see that there's definitely some business cycle effects here, so that when we see a Great Recession, we see the most precipitous decline, but in other prior recessions as well, giving decreased, the economy turns around and it comes back and giving starts to grow. I think one of the things that's noteworthy is that historically, giving recovered within 1 or 2 years typically of a recession. The 73-75 OPEC-induced recession was the longest lasting effect, and that took 3 years to get back to where we were. 3 years out of the Great Recession, we are still 8% below where we were before the Great Recession began. Okay, so we have a lot of work to do and a ways to go. Household giving as a percentage of personal income, 1.9%. And I think this is another profound challenge for the sector. And I think if you, how many of you go to Starbucks every day? Okay, there's some people who are lying. I don't go every day, but I'm in airports a lot, and I go when I'm in an airport, and I see a lot of people there. And one of the things that struck me, though, the first time I went to Starbucks is I took a bunch of my nieces the first time I went, and they all had these little foo-foo orders that, I'll have this with a that and a twist and a blah, 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 and sprinkles, and it was like $7 a drink. I was like, oh, we'll use a credit card. It was shocking how expensive it was. Now, I know we all need our caffeine fixes, or many of us do, and we get it in different forms, but arguably, and this is not to devalue Starbucks because they're a very creative corporation. They spend more money on health insurance for their employees than they do the coffee bean, so I think that's remarkable. But obviously, I would characterize this as superfluous consumption. Now, whether it's Starbucks or an expensive car or excessive jewelry, vacations, whatever it is, we all spend money somewhat frivolously, right? Now, not every American, has excess money, but many Americans do. And I did just kind of a back of the envelope calculation. If everybody reallocated $5 a day from frivolous consumption to philanthropy, that would double household giving overnight. So I don't think this is impossible. But I think for those of us in the sector, fundraisers, EDs, and so on, how do we move that dial from 1.9% of income to 4 or 5%? Not to mention 10%. Okay. I don't have an answer, but I think it's an important question. Giving by foundations also shows some business cycle effects. One of the things that's really, I think, noteworthy, though, is the very rapid growth of foundation grant making, which is reflective of foundation assets. And so we've seen, particularly following the tech boom in the mid-1990s until the attack on America and the recession that followed that, we had really unparalleled growth. And we lost a little ground in 2001, 2002, but it came back. And so even though we had this tech boom and then the bubble burst, it's been sustained at fairly high levels and rapid growth. Bequest giving is somebody who does empirical analysis and forecasting for part of my living. This is my nightmare. You look at this data, and this is more like a yo-yo than a trend line, right? You can't forecast yo-yo patterns, right? This is very difficult. But one of the things that we find is that bequest giving, like everything else, tends to move with the business cycle at some level or another. But whether or not the data for Giving USA and the entire country for bequest giving goes up or goes down in any one given year is driven entirely by the 300 largest estates that are processed that year. And almost entirely that rate of change from a big plus to a big minus is driven by 1, 2, 3, or at most 5 estates. Okay, so these billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar estates are the things that make that go up or go down a lot, apart from the trend. Those are also impossible to forecast. I paid 3 graduate econ students over the course of 3 summers to analyze this data. 3 different teams of 3 different, over 3 different summers, and we pounded on this data. And I worked closely with these graduate students, and really the only thing we could conclude about bequest giving is that people don't time their deaths with changes in the business cycle. Humor, thank you. But also truth. Corporations are very much affected by the business cycle, and we see that in corporate giving. One of the most astounding factoids coming out of this year's Giving USA is the fairly rapid growth in corporate giving this year and last. Over 12% this year in nominal dollars, almost 10% in inflation-adjusted dollars. Clearly, corporate profitability has grown more rapidly than the economy, and corporate giving has grown more rapidly than the economy. And I think that creates some interesting questions and tensions for us as a society, but I think it's a great outcome. And I think one of the things that has become not, I won't say ubiquitous, but more widespread is that most corporations, most big corporations now, have a philanthropy budget. And it's no longer something that, the CEO decides, on his own or her own at their desk. There's conversations, and it's become a much more part of the corporate culture. Well, that's the good news. Bad news, corporate giving is stuck at less than 1% of pre-tax corporate profits. And in fact, during and since the Great Recession, it has hovered at 0.8%. So not 8%, 0.8% for the last several years. The 40-year average is 0.9%, so even at a relatively lower average rate, we're subpar performance. All right, where does the money go? Well, about a third goes to religion. 40 years ago, 20 years ago, that number would have been over half, and we'll see that in a minute. But I think this is an important point to make, that giving to religion typically has been like the tortoise in the hare. It continued to grow slowly throughout the business cycle. It didn't grow rapidly in good times, but it tended to continue to grow slowly in bad times. 2 out of the 3 years of the recovery, giving to religious organizations actually declined in inflation-adjusted dollars. And for most of the last decade, it has been very slow growing or declining. So I think this is an interesting phenomenon. Now, we know from other research that we've done using a panel study of households that basically people don't give to religious organizations if they don't attend mass, mosque, synagogue, okay, or other houses of worship. And simultaneously, we know that every generation, going back to the silent generation, attends mass, mosque, synagogue less often than their parents and grandparents. Again, I'm not making a moral judgment, I'm an empiricist, but what we're seeing for mainline houses of worship is that this is a more difficult environment and that they are losing market share. Now, frankly, I think most religious organizations spend very little time, energy, much less money, trying to raise money, and that they're underperforming. And if they ever get serious about fundraising, the secular charities better watch out. Okay? So, that said, going around the horn, human services and education are tied at 13%. Human services bounces around a little bit with changes in the economy and changes in public policy, but I think that this is an important piece. The fourth largest subsector is giving to foundations at 10%. Now, for any one of us as a charity, we'd rather have those dollars coming into our endowments, right, rather than to a foundation endowment. But at the same time, the good news for charities is those dollars are permanently committed to the philanthropic sector. So they continue to pay out 5% forever. All right, I'm going to go a little bit faster, but I think when you look at some of the smaller subsectors, I want to talk a little bit about those when we look at the rates of growth, which I think is coming up here in a second. I mentioned this before that, you know, if you look at this 40-year trend for the first 20 years on this and effectively 25 years, religion got over half, and education has been pretty stable at 13, 14, 15%. One of the things that has grown fairly rapidly percentage-wise is environment and animals went from kind of a trace element to it's now almost 3%. International went from a relatively small amount and has tripled in terms of their market share since 1987, and they're now at over 6%. Those two subsectors have grown the most rapidly. One of the things that I've written a paper about in terms of household giving is that when you look at the rates of growth of public expenditures, governmental expenditures, the fastest growing subsectors, and those tend to be the slowest growing over long periods of time in terms of private philanthropic support. So I think one of the interesting phenomenon that we'll have to watch for Obamacare and the impact on society. Now, I want to be careful to say, I'm not arguing against Obamacare. I think there's a lot of good potential with that. But I think it will create a tougher environment for fundraising for healthcare organizations. Okay? Again, I'm not arguing against it, but I think that the empirical trend long term is we don't, as a society, don't spend very much money of public dollars on international affairs. That's the fastest growing part of the pie over the last 20, 30 years. When you look at environment, we don't spend very much tax dollars on environment. Again, one of the fastest growing subsectors. Healthcare, we're going to see whether or not that trend continues with the implementation of Obamacare. This shows the 2-year trends, and I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail right now, but you can see one of the patterns that has emerged is during the Great Recession and immediately afterwards, giving to human services increased. Many donors and foundations said, we're going to spend more money helping house the homeless and feed the hungry. And as a fundraiser, I had donors tell me that. Look, I'm not going to give you very much this year because our family made this choice. And you can't really say, that's a bad decision. Don't do that. The proper answer is, yeah, I understand and respect that. Please keep us in mind when the recovery comes along, and we'll stay in touch. But those are tough conversations. But what we've seen this year is a return to this status quo ante. Big growth in giving to the arts, big growth in giving to education, big growth in environment, and human services has grown, but that rate of growth is slower than it was the last several years. All right, briefly going through the different uses, you can see that giving to religious organizations has kind of plodded along, but has really plateaued out, going back to the early part of this century. And I think that this is, again, going to be a challenge for mainline religions. I also want to say, I don't think it's necessarily the case that people are less spiritual or less interested, but they are just not attending, and they're not giving if they're not attending. All right, giving to education. Education, we track publicly reported gifts of $1 million or more as a separate study, and it's on our website. And higher ed gets between a half and 2/3 of all the $1 million gifts that are publicly reported, okay? The grateful alum, so, you go to school and it makes you a great person and so on and so forth, and you give back. It's, so higher ed gets a disproportionate share of the gifts. As a result, though, you see some boom-bust aspects to that higher ed does suffer when we have a recession and the stock market goes down as it did during the Great Recession. Human services has been on a kind of a long, steady climb, and as you can see that people really did kind of step up to the plate and increase giving to human service organizations during the Great Recession, and that's, I think, commendable in lots of ways. But we'll have to watch and see what happens as hopefully the recovery continues. Giving to foundations, we saw a decline last year, and this looks a little odd given the fact that the stock market went up so much, over 13% in inflation-adjusted dollars. And I think that the plausible answer there is that the year before, the stock market was pretty flat, and I think I think people last year were kind of holding back, and they were waiting to see, is this recovery going to be sustained? What's the tax policy environment going to be? What is the proposed caps? Is that going to happen, and so on limiting household donations to 28%? What impact that would have, and so on. So I think people are doing a little wait and see with that. Giving to health. In the mid-1990s, we had a number of hospital conversions, so they created foundations, so you had a big bump up in that. But otherwise, we've seen a pretty steady trend upwards, and again, we'll see the impact of Obamacare on that. Public society benefit are those charities that are combined funds, like the United Ways, the federated campaigns for the federal government, but also the Jewish funds and other federated campaigns. One of the pieces included in this is donor advised funds. The 4 largest national donor advised funds reported growth on average of 77% last year. Well, you can't have them growing 77% and the other parts of the combined funds, public society benefits, growing at 77% and have it look like this, okay? What that suggests is the other part of the public society benefit piece of the pie has been flat or declining, and hopefully we'll have some more data disaggregating this in the future. Giving to international affairs, this is in part driven by natural disasters around the world, but only in part. I think one of the things that's happened, if you look at going back to 2001, following the attack on America, the market share of our giving that went global increased appreciably. And I think one of the takeaways, there are a lot of bad things that happened, obviously, with the attack on America, but I think one of the takeaways is that we started thinking about our role in the world in a little bit different manner, and we are giving more globally as a result, I think. Arts and culture, man, they took a big hit during the Great Recession, right? So the good news for them is they're starting to dig out. And again, it's hard to argue. If you're an arts organization, I think it's hard to argue if someone says, an individual or foundation says, hey, we're not giving you a gift this year, or we're not giving you much because we're giving to feed the hungry. Again, you can't say, well, that's a bad choice. Okay? But you have to hope and continue to work and invest in fundraising, and now we're seeing some returns to that. Environment and animals, big growth in market share since 1987 when Giving USA first started tracking that, a bit of a drop in this decade in its market share, and starting to recover since as we come out of the Great Recession. All right, a few key points just to summarize. Charitable giving increased 3.5% in current dollars, 1.5% in inflation-adjusted dollars. Third consecutive year of increased giving. So again, the glass is half full, as evidenced by those two factors. Almost 10% increase, and that's in inflation-adjusted dollars in corporate giving, 2.3% increase in inflation-adjusted dollars for foundation grant making. But the glass half empty, it may take another 6 or 7 years if the economy continues at its current pace and the recovery and the philanthropic markets continues at its current pace. It would take another 6 or 7 years to get back to where we were in 2007. So I think that's a disconcerting thought. Arts and culture, we mentioned, nice rebound, 7.8% after a pretty tough period. Religious giving, we talked about being flat in nominal dollars, but actually declined in inflation-adjusted dollars 2 out of the last 3 years during the recovery from the Great Recession. Again, public society benefits mostly driven, went up over 5%, but mostly driven by the fairly rapid growth in donor advice funds. One of the things that affected the East Coast more than the rest of the country was Hurricane Sandy. Our estimates are that $400 million was given to hurricane relief efforts in 2012 and another $100 million in 2013. Big dollar amounts affected some charities a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it was just over 0.1% of total giving last year. So not a big driver for total giving, clearly had a disproportionate impact on some charities. Some charities got wiped out, right? If you're about to have your annual fund, your big gala, and that facility got destroyed, or your facility got destroyed, that's a tough thing to overcome, I think, for many charities. All right, now we're going to go to a panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Bob to tell us what to do.
So, among other things, I'm on the editorial review board for this great study, and have been watching some of the figures and the report and so on. We'll give you some information how to obtain a copy of this report before you leave today. But I have 6 observations to be the skunk at the picnic for today. I think that the decline in giving to religion is a bad predictor of what lies ahead, because we know that people who are faith-based give best. And if there's a decline in giving to religion, this is a possible precursor of further deterioration of giving by Americans. Number 2, the percent of household giving, that 1.9% slide, frightening. Absolutely frightening to me, because we're seated here around the corner from one of the wealthiest zip codes in Pennsylvania and in the United States. What are we seeing as a percent of giving? We in the nonprofit world, those who represent nonprofits, those who are donors, we need to move that quickly and much, much higher. Number 3, what's the donor's perspective? Donors are looking for impact. This is a different conversation than what we've been seeing for many decades in the nonprofit world, and the nonprofit community of America is not responding with the right messages. We have to wake up. Those of us who are working with the nonprofit world. One of the realities is there's no more competition. In fact, the IRS over the last couple of years has done house cleaning, and the number of nonprofits has decreased by 250,000 nonprofits. Number 4, what's the vision of our nonprofit community, and are we conveying that properly? And are we being transparent in the information that we convey to our donors? Financial transparency still hasn't caught up with what donors are looking for. Number 5, I think that we're in a very serious bind right now in the nonprofit world about retaining donors. One of the statistics that's included elsewhere in the full report is the number of one-time donors has escalated dramatically in 2012. and repeat donors are not repeating. And finally, we have a serious threat to the future of charitable giving, and it's at our fingertips right now, and that is that the tax deductibility of issue is about to come to a high point again, probably in July or August or September. And I'm very, very frightened that those of us in this room are asleep at the switch. We are not really pressing the issues about the tax deduction of charitable giving with our elected officials in Washington. I think that we're going to pay the price, because the last thing we need to do is to allow a change, I think, to the credibility of the nonprofit sector, and it's happening. Now, I know that Eileen and John don't necessarily share the negativity that I've just put on the table. I'm frightened. I think the dollars are available, and I'd like to hear from Eileen and John in terms of your head.
You know, it's interesting. I just put some numbers around it. I'm involved in the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, which is an offshoot of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. It's a study we've been doing for the last 6 years, and it measures donor retention. So in the last 5 years, donor retention has dropped from 50% to 49%. That's a 20% decrease. Imagine that right now, you're only retaining 41% of your donors. If you were a pizza shop or Starbucks, and that's the only time 60% of your people never came back again, you'd be out of business. It's a huge issue. But what's even worse is new donor retention. It's only 27%. One could be said, though, is what you should focus on is repeat donor retention. It's around 70%. So once they give that second gift, getting to give them that second gift means that much more, because they go to 70%. So I think while the results they're challenging and grim, at least we know what we need to focus on. And so, you know, I think donor retention is a huge issue, but it's also, there's other areas as well, you know, just going back to the basics with best practices, what I like to call oatmeal topics. You know, everyone knows it's good for you, but, you know, don't exactly exercise and, you know, eat your oatmeal.
Thanks. Always great to hear Bob's comments. I think my mother told me I was born with a smile on my face, so she said that. I don't remember, but I just do. You know what? I have this glasses half full kind of attitude about life, and I think it's I was obviously born with it, but I actually think there's enormously good news in this. And about 6 years ago, in the onset of the recession, I was in a room at the Ritz-Carlton with two of the economists. They're twin brothers who are great predictors of economic trends. And at that room, and it was pretty boring. I sat there for 2 hours. It was painful after about the first half hour. But they basically said this is going to be a really slow economic recovery, the slowest we've ever had. So for those of you who are in business, it was a Vistage group. You're going to have a really tough, slow recovery, so get ready for it. And that was something that I heard. So when I saw this data coming out, and I saw the data, I actually was affirmed that those gentlemen were correct. And if anybody wants their names, I could probably find them. Their banks rely on them. They have the highest predictability for predicting economic trends. Fascinating guys. But the other piece of this is that giving is going up, and it's going up in I think, significant rates. Do I think that means that everything's great? No. Do I think that means there's a shift in how we're looking at philanthropy? Absolutely. You know what? The internet's taking over. I know giving still, and the internet is still 10%, but I think there's ways in which the sector needs to embrace and figure out how to take advantage of that. The greatest generation that Tom Brokaw wrote about, which were the original creators of all the federated funding models, the federated funding models surrendered giving decisions to other people. Donor advised funds allow people to stay in charge of their giving, and so do private foundations. So I think there's a shift in how philanthropic dollars are being used and who we're surrendering our decisions to. I also believe that, while religion is going down, and I agree that religious people that attend, people are still spiritual, and I think there's ways in which that kind of energy, if it's a zero-sum game, essentially, if we're giving around 2%, that money is going to other things. I think the trends in international giving are not going to go away, and I think for local organizations that's really a challenge because the world's becoming more global with all the news media, and given to Kiva, I mean, there's so many internet quick ways to give $25. This idea of loyalty that John talked about clearly is really important, because if you need to get donors to give their second gifts, it means we have to really be clear about how to make the case for support. And for those of you, when you see, text for $10, the idea that those people aren't texting again for $10 is not surprising. So we have this crowdfunding model that's really new and emerging, and I think for those of us in the sector, I don't think we really know how to use those tools yet to really maximize who we are. But the line is going up. We are recovering slowly. Those two economists predicted it, and I think it's going to continue to go up. I talked to somebody recently who started a business about 15 years ago and then started a charity about 3 years ago, and he said something to me. I couldn't believe it when he said it. His name was Ron Bruder. He started an organization called the EFE Foundation. He said he had an idea for a business. He created a business plan, took 6 months. He went to banks. He got funding, private equity funding, and within a year and a half, he had a business. Within whatever couple years, it was profitable. He said he decided, it was actually after 9/11, he decided he wanted to do something to stem radical youth, emergence of radical youth in the part of the world in which terrorists came from. And he had a business idea, but it was a charitable entity. He wrote a plan, and he said it's the most difficult thing he could ever imagine, trying to raise money. And here's a guy, very few people that have been on both sides of that line. So and the lesson in that to me is that we are in a really hard business. People don't surrender money in the same way for charitable causes. And we have an evolving use of media. We have an evolving use of opportunities for how to find donors, and obviously this repeat donors. So while the line is going up, we're clearly in a shift. The baby boomers are retiring. I think there's an incredible opportunity with Next Gen. I deal with those. I'm privileged to teach a course at Penn, and I think the Next Gen is really embracing the idea of how the sector is going to run and what they're doing. They're not in leadership roles yet, but I think I predict the line is going to continue to go up. I do totally agree with Patrick that exceeding 2%, getting over that 1.9. I think we're at I don't know where we are exactly right now. 1.7, 1.9. If we could getting to 10%, maybe that's what you'd call a stretch goal. Getting to 3% would be fascinating. Could we really grow that piece of the pie? And one last thing before I stop is just that the Hudson Institute does a great study on international philanthropy of countries around the world. And in every measure, the U.S. is not number one. But relative to the rest of the world, while we could say we could be a Chicken Little and say that this isn't good enough, we outperform in philanthropy the rest of the world by such a significant amount, and it doesn't mean we can't do better. We always have to strive to do better no matter what we're doing personally and professionally, but I think there's a lot of good news in this report, and getting depressed and down is not a way to figure out how to do better. I think you really have to look at opportunities. So I think there's a lot out there, and I have to say I have a lot of confidence in the Next Gen, the baby boomers handing the torch over, because I think there's enormous energy and investment in where we're going to be, and I'm glad that the line is going up.
Thank you. As a former student of Eileen Heisman, it feels really good to hear that she still has so much confidence in us. There's a couple of us here, and on a personal note, it feels great to know that we've stayed in Philadelphia, that we're still working in philanthropy, and I think it bodes really well for Philadelphia's nonprofit sector in the years moving ahead. My name is Lancy Sylvia. I am the Director of Communications for EHL Consulting. I've been collecting questions on Twitter and walking around and getting questions beforehand. So the first question we have from Twitter is, can you dive into the donor advised funds a little bit more? Somebody wanted to see that parsed out a bit.
I'm happy to talk, but I just want one of your comments about giving to foundations as not being as robust as once was. I think that when you're talking about people using vehicles, clearly donor-advised funds are emerging in popularity. There's about $38 billion in donor-advised funds, and we've increased dramatically over the last few years. We do a National Donor-Advised Fund report. We're now in partnership with Giving USA on giving the data. We survey about 650 organizations that manage donor-advised funds. The thing about donor-advised funds that's really interesting is that they're going at a faster pace than foundations. For every private foundation, there's 2 donor-advised funds. It's soon going to be 3. The thing about private foundations, and this is a really important statistics, is that private foundations have to give out 5%. It's required by law, and that includes overhead. So whatever they pay to their staff and for rent and all those things are included in the 5%. Donor-advised funds, on average, for the last few years have given out 17%, not including overhead, which doesn't include staff salaries. So donor-advised funds are actually giving out at more than triple the rate of private foundations, and if you take overhead, more. So, and just for NPT as an example, we've raised about $3.3 billion in almost 17 years, and we've given away half of our assets, $1.7 billion, all over the country and the world. And so donor-advised fund assets are moving out in grants at a much greater rate. So you can point to donor-advised funds and say, you know, they're taking this money that otherwise would have gone someplace else, but the rate in which we're paying grants out is more than triple of a private foundation. And so that's I hope, a benefit to the sector. Most private foundations, when they see the 5%, they actually stick to the 5%. They're not paying out more, because over time they're willing, that would put them out of business. So the idea of donor-advised funds growing means that you have to grow keeping pace with the grants that are going out. I think they, to a great extent, I hate this phrase because it's such a kind of catch-all, but it democratizes philanthropy in the sense that you don't have to be the ultra, ultra high net worth to have a foundation or the look and feel of a foundation. You can do it through a donor-advised fund. You can pass it down through a generation. They don't have spending rules. You can spend the whole thing down, so they're really flexible giving vehicles, and it makes somebody, a family or an individual, feel like they have a really formal giving vehicle. The other thing, and of course everybody knows, they're mostly web-based transactions now, so you can make a grant request at 2 o'clock in the morning, or you can, fax something in, but it makes it a formal giving vehicle available 24/7. And of course, one of the other attributions for donor-advised funds is some of the charities are housed with financial institutions, and therefore you have bankers and financial advisors getting involved in philanthropic activities in ways that we didn't have 10 years ago. So that's very, very different.
Just a couple comments. One, the donor advised funds are about 1/4 of the total in public society benefits. So when you think about what's driving what, that's it's about 1/4, and we hope to work with MPT and Eileen to disaggregate that in a more timely manner for Giving USA in the future. The other thing I would say is, I think the donor advised funds are popular because of the flexibility and so on. There are some calls for greater accountability and transparency, and so we'll see. That's an interesting policy
Sure,
thing, and
absolutely.
what the impact on that might be. And then finally, I think that the donor advised funds, because of the flexibility, and we've seen this rapid growth, and so I think that donors are responding to this. And Bob has said that people may be parking money in donor advised funds to wait and see what the future is. But there are, as I pointed out, they're fairly rapid payouts, and so. I think one of the challenges for foundations is they're required by law to pay out 5%, but instead of treating that as a minimum, they've also treated it as a minimum and a maximum. And they don't have to, but most of them do. And I think one policy recommendation I would make that's not related to Giving USA, but I just think would be better for society, is to allow foundations and encourage foundations to pay out less in good times and pay out substantially more in bad times. During the Great Recession, it would have been much better had foundations been paying out 10% and then pay out a smaller percentage in good years. So that would be helpful for the business cycle and also helpful for charities.
So a number of people here represent nonprofits in Greater Philadelphia. So I have two challenges to those of you who are frontline. Number one, retrofit your record keeping to show if your donors have a donor advised fund. Remember years ago when we added facts to the profile? This is the time to add donor advised fund, yes or no. And number two, ask your donors if in fact they have a donor advised fund. They'll share that in all likelihood, but it is not public information. You have to do the research. You have to ask your donors. And no amount of online research going to Wealth Engine or whatever will reflect whether donors have a donor advised fund in their possession. You have to be more aggressive. and look at the donor advised fund as a bank account for future charitable giving.
That's a great segue to the next question. What specific takeaways within the report can be applied to the greater Philadelphia area, nonprofits in this room? What are the key trends that they should be looking out for?
I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the Philadelphia region would take and parse that data out differently than the national data. I mean, if I were a religious institution, I would say I certainly have my work cut out for me. Education, it's interesting, when we look at our giving at NPT, our biggest part of the pie is education and not religion. So I don't know if we have particularly secular donors or reflects something else. But for those, if you're working in part of the sector, in part of those pieces of the pie in which it's growing, it's fortunate. I'm not sure that it's because we're better fundraisers necessarily, or that it's post-recession behavior. But I think our work is cut out for us. And for those of you that are fundraisers, and I wear a fundraising hat almost all the time because of my training, is that we can never be too smart about how we make a case for support. We can never sit on our laurels about something that worked a while ago and what we need to do now. So I think we really, if talking to this part of the people in the room that are actually actively fundraising, using incredibly good tools like Donor Perfect, knowing how to diversify, how to make the case, and what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. So I think there's no room for kind of laying back when you're in the development role. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be smart and thoughtful about how you do it, but I think the other lesson, I think John's comments about how to keep your donors engaged what do you do after somebody's expressed an interest in you to keep donors committed and interested in your organization is really an important comment. If I know there's some people here from arts organizations, the fact that funds to arts organizations is going up is wonderful. When I worked at the Philadelphia Foundation, one of my early philanthropy teachers, mentors said, a healthy arts and cultural environment in a city or country is a sign of a healthy society. And so the idea that funding to the arts is going up is a great sign that in general, that the healthiness of our society is being restored from a recession mentality.
I'll just add one or two things. So in Giving USA, we're looking at national trends, and so we can't really comment on specific cities or states. But one thing that we have done in other studies is we've done studies of giving in Chicago, in Atlanta, Memphis, Kansas City, and so on, and several different states. One of the things that we found in those studies is that the vast majority of the dollars that are given by households in particular remain in that community. Now, I said earlier that international is growing rapidly, but even with that, the vast majority of the dollars by individuals given stay local or regional. Similarly, for corporations and foundations, most of the dollars remain local or regional. And so I think if you were to extrapolate for Philadelphia, you'd say, most of your donors are going to be to the local charities are going to be within, an hour's drive or so. And so if you're, thinking about how do you fundraise more effectively and more efficiently, I would keep that in mind.
I think the one takeaway also from this report is that there's great wealth in America. Wall Street, all-time high, corporate profits going way up. We in the nonprofit sector here in Philadelphia need to be more aggressive in challenging donors to give better, more, and more quickly, and to see the impact that their dollars can have. I had a conversation just a couple weeks ago with one of the wealthiest members of the Philadelphia philanthropic community, who is intending to challenge others in the giving community to raise the bar. And I think that we need to link our arms together, all of us in this room and others who didn't come today, to say, same as last year is not good enough. And I think that while, yes, we've had 3 consecutive years of growth, they're baby steps, and we're at a time where we have to really say more is needed. We're witnessing a serious catastrophe with the school district. and quality of public education. We're witnessing what will be long-term impact on a deteriorating great city. We can't allow that to happen.
Right, and it's very important to keep asking. I can't, you have to understand, I'm on these boards with people, they don't know fundraising. Like, oh, we can't go after XYZ again. We just hit them up 3 months ago, 4 months ago. That is a huge mistake. You have to keep asking. The wealth is there.
So final question before we open it up to everyone here, and that's what the microphones in the middle are for. One of our audience members wants to know, what's the panel's take on the influx of social enterprise? And is Giving USA interested in studying that in the future?
That's a great question.
Well, so I'm hesitant only because I'm not sure how to define social enterprise.
I was asking the same question.
But I think it's intriguing, and so on the one hand, as somebody who studies this, studies philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, but also fundraises, I am a little concerned about low and limited profitability and social enterprise corporations and so on, because I think it will confuse some donors. So for example, there are a lot of corporations in the United States who are for-profits, and they are coincidentally a low or limited profitability entity. And if they're going to say to donors, hey, invest in us, that's a different business model. I also think there is something to be said, and that the hole in the dam, so to speak, is already there and widening perhaps, and that there's some appeal because when you think about the ability for nonprofits to raise money in the capital markets, it's fairly limited, whereas opposed to for-profit entities, and you think about going out and raising stocks and issuing bonds and so on, it's a new business model, and so I think we have to look at that and be open to it. I think a collateral effect of that, though, will be that some donors and some foundations will jump on that bandwagon because it's new, it's sexy, it's different, and there's a new rhetoric around that. And I have a concern that for some more traditional charities, they may be disadvantaged in the fundraising marketplace for that. Not arguing against it, but concerned.
Eileen?
I just talked to somebody at the Ford Foundation recently about socially responsible investing and impact investing, and she reminded me that they've been doing it for 40 years. So I think it's more coming to the marketplace to the average person now, but it's actually been happening for a long time. I think one of the issues with it means so many different things. I mean, there's B corporations, LC3s, there's socially responsible investing, there's public, PRIs, and so it doesn't mean one thing. And so the idea of having to count it and figure out its impact is a multi-complex notion, and even if you ask people in the sector, what does each one mean, I'm not sure we could all answer it very clearly. So I think eventually it'll be understood better and counted, but right now it's a pretty crowded marketplace, but growing, and there's a lot of interest in having businesses that have social impact. I do think that if you're involved with one of those, at some point in time when you're running one, you have to decide what's more important, the social impact or the business. I think those are tough choices to make if you're in one of those blended entities, but I don't think that's a reason to stop, and I think it's going to emerge. So maybe like donor advised funds are now, which is emerging part of that pie, maybe social impact investing or whatever you want to call it, will be one in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. Last year I had the honor of being invited to the White House for a discussion on when the Obama administration wanted to think about ways to catalyze the philanthropic sector, and MRIs and PRIs were a big part of the conversation, and the Heron Foundation had just announced that they were
Going 100%.
Going 100%,
Yeah.
right.
Clara.
And so absolutely intriguing idea, and arguably a brilliant insight.
Brilliant,
okay?
really, absolutely.
At the same time, so the School of Philanthropy, we just released a study on MRIs and PRIs, and Ford is, a pathbreaker in this, but of the national assets in the foundation grant-making community, 1.3% were used for PRI or MRI last year, and it's bounced around 1%, but it's stuck there for the last several years. And a very small percentage of all foundations use it at all.
Can you define MRI and PRI for the
Oh,
audience?
I'm sorry,
just in
mission-related
case?
investments and program-related investments. So,
Excellent.
so foundations are required by law to pay out 5% of their asset base through grants. The other 95%, they're investing generally in the stock market or stock and bond markets and real estate markets to a lesser degree. And that generates the returns, and they can use that. Well, an MRI or PRI is they can make a loan, they can buy stocks, they can do things that are related to their programs or the mission, but it's not a grant, it's not a gift, it's not a grant. The money is expected to come back as part of a business model. So that'll be a way for that foundation to sustain their assets forever. Now, they may have a lower return, there may be higher risk, and so that's where most of the foundations have shied away from that, because the staff and the board and the financial advisors have said, well, look, go in the stock market, the bond market, and it's more predictable. But, Heron Foundation, 100% all in, that's there's some chutzpah there, right? I mean, and I think that's it's a great thing, and I think it's a good role model for the rest of us to think about.
All right, we'd love to hear from you guys. Anyone? We had a great question from Mike from the audience. If you could stand up and use the mics.
I probably don't need it.
Well, doesn't sound like you do.
In trying to relate a lot of the different topics that have been brought up, the thing that I think I heard is that the endowment message may not be quite as impacting as the immediate impact, since the trending is that a donor wants to see immediate impact for their giving and whatnot. So where's the message on endowment building, future visioning, that kind of conversation?
Great question.
Go ahead, Bob.
Every nonprofit that I'm aware of has to deal with today as well as the long term. If a nonprofit isn't building its endowment, it will be ultimately at death's door. We've witnessed just over the last number of months a number of nonprofits that are dozens of years old that never addressed the issue of endowment building, and they're in serious financial jeopardy. One of the things that we say to our clients at EHL Consulting is, well, you can never have a large enough endowment as a nonprofit, witness Harvard, or the University of Pennsylvania. The rule of thumb as a result of the Great Recession from EHL Consulting is that you should have an endowment at least 5 times annual budget. We used to say 2 to 3 times annual budget. We know there's going to be another downturn in the economy, and donors who are annual donors and have a commitment to an organization will in fact be open, we believe, to the conversation about building endowment without jeopardizing annual giving.
Saw one, many. If you feel like you can project. Let's do the gentleman with the yellow tie first, and then the gentleman with the yellow shirt. So yellow tie first. That's you. Sorry, is that gold? Goldenrod.
My question was, is really concerning the sort of tax, the issues going on in Washington about tax deductibility and how critical that is for two reasons. One, the sort of historic wisdom from a behavioral economic standpoint, the donut intent always trumps tax deductibility, at least at a general level. And B, I haven't heard anything really in the sort of field about the sort of rise of crowdfunding as sort of a third rail. There's last year, I think it's something close to $4 billion people are shelling out that is neither equity investment nor philanthropy. They're not giving this money to charities. It's a sort of different psychology of giving and investing sort of quotation. So I wondered if you could talk about that sort of phenomenon and the psychosocial sort of trends that are driving that, and are we looking at a new trend that is not philanthropy but something else? I don't know what to call it.
Okay, yeah, great question. So we got a call from the White House asking us for an analysis of the differential impacts of differential caps. And we agreed to do this, and I said, I just want you to know at the end of the day, I'm probably going to disagree with your recommendation in public. Okay, so the Obama administration has consistently proposed a 28% cap on tax deductions for charitable donations. And we've written a couple white papers on this, and have another one in the works looking at this. And at the end of the day, I mean, the key bottom line is with that 20% cap, total giving among tax itemizers drops by less than 1%. So the White House's view of this is, relatively small impact on charity and has a beneficial treasury effect, right? Tax revenues go up. However, among those who are affected by the policy, because most Americans aren't affected by that policy, right? But those affected by the policy, giving goes down by 3%. We have had, again, so in the Obama administration's defense, they argue, well, it's a relatively small deal. I would argue that's not a small deal, particularly in a time when charities are being squeezed from all the revenue sources, earned income, endowment income. The government at all levels, federal, state, and local, has their own fiscal cliff to deal with. So contracts and grants from governments are declining or stagnant. You put this all together at a time of increased demand for services, and I think it's a bad formula. The other piece that is a little bit more intangible is we've had the School of Philanthropy, we have donors on the far left and on the far right who have said, ideologically, we think the tax caps are unfair. And so we put a footnote in our report to the White House and said, here's the estimated impact, and it may be wildly off because of this unfairness effect. People react to fairness. And if they think that something is truly unfair, and we're hearing this from the left and from the right and everybody in between, it could have a bigger impact than what our models forecast. So I think it's a bad policy for a lot of reasons. It also drives a wedge. It's kind of a backdoor way of eliminating the tax deductibility by driving a wedge between the full value of the tax deduction and a cap on it that says, charity's not as important.
Right.
Slippery slope.
I really think it'll be the first time that's done, and once you cap it at 28, then it can go to 22, and then,
Right.
So it sets a precedent where you're unbundling something that's been bundled together for almost 100 years. So I think that's a really sacred bundle, and once you start chipping away at it, it's hard to know what the bottom would be.
Yeah, I agree. On your crowdsourcing question, okay, I'm going to sound like a really old man at this point. I just think it's stupid. It's not philanthropy. It's not a tax-deductible gift. So it's
not rational.
It's informal, and it's probably illegal. A lot of this is being done on the internet against the site licenses and so on and so forth. And there's no vetting, there's no verification. I could say I've looked. I've done media interviews for this, so I've people, reporters have sent me hot links to look at this, isn't this fascinating? Yeah, fascinating but stupid. Okay, why would I give you money to go write a book? Or allegedly make a movie, or allegedly do a documentary, or allegedly write a poem. If you're my friend or my child, yeah, maybe. But why would I do that for a stranger? So I'm old, I don't get that. I just don't get it. And so I'm not going to endorse that in any way, and so I'm a Luddite in that perspective. I know it's growing, I know it's dollars, but it's probably illegal. It doesn't make sense. I can't wrap my arms around it, sorry.
I just want to say, I feel completely differently. I don't know whether it's...
Probably everyone in the room does too, that's all.
Who's the
I don't
spend at
know.
the picnic now?
There's probably a lot of different models in which people approach crowdfunding, but I think for those that are legitimate, and I don't know if some are legal or illegal, I don't know that much about, I think it's an enormously efficient way to gather capital to launch something new and different that you otherwise wouldn't have access to the capital markets. I think we're in that shift. I think people are gathering assets in different ways. The web has given us an enormous opportunity. I think we're in our infancy, and I think, like anything else, it'll become probably more regulated. You pick those entities that you trust in the web, and so I don't think it's stupid. I think it's interesting. I think it's kind of like being in the wild, wild west, and we're looking for gold. It reminds me of that a little bit. So I think the jury's going to be out. It could be that some parts of it are stupid, but I think some parts of it are fascinating and provide great opportunities. So and it's not going it's not going to, I don't think opportunity is going to be disappearing anytime soon. I think it's going to stay pretty in the forefront.
Correct. I think what it's really done is completely made the process of asking very, very efficient. And whereas before you couldn't collect money cross-country easily at all, now it's just a point-click credit card, boom, you're in. And it's also one of the reasons why we're seeing an influx of just a tremendous number of new donors, people in their 20s, 30s that traditionally would never give. I love going to these conferences, these tech conferences, and the average age is probably 26. And I say, hey, how many people have given a gift online? Of course, they all raise their hands, and I tell them, you're all an anomaly. It's a statistical anomaly, all right? Because the real average age of donors, we all know, is 65 years old, okay? But what funding is doing, it's really getting the ask, the democratization, is that I pronounced it wrong, but of the ask out there and making it incredibly more efficient, and it's going to just continue to grow whether or not it's stupid.
Now I'm curious. If you've given to a crowd-funded campaign in the last 12 months, can you raise your hand? Oh, about
my
half.
God.
Interesting.
All right, so I'm really wrong. I'm also,
Gentlemen,
so let me just say, but here's, I'm just challenged by this because, when the text funding for disaster relief and so on, this is terrible fundraising. At the end of the day, you're bringing in some new donors and so on, but you can't steward that gift, you can't acknowledge that gift, and you can't go back for another gift. And it's not a relationship-based, it's a one and done, and, and $10 is not going to cut it. So you text in $10, boom, big deal.
But that's the difference, though. Text funding is terrible, okay? It only works for, disasters. That's about it. And that's not a good business model to be in. But what does work is around the asking. And but what nonprofits have not been able to crack the code is to get the people that donated because of somebody else to donate again. And that's really the real challenge.
I promised the gentleman in the yellow shirt.
Good morning. You've all mentioned the notion of impact philanthropy. I'm wondering if you could give us some brief words in terms of what that means exactly, and to the charity and to us fundraisers, how we should be asking for dollars and how we should be stewarding, thanking these donors. Is it increasing or decreasing the amount of time that we have to show an impact of the gift?
I will give you one factoid, and then I'll let the professional fundraisers speak more eloquently about this and what you should do as a fundraiser. But we do a study every other year for Bank of America on philanthropy among high net worth households, and over the last several years, one of the motivations for giving that has jumped off the page and has grown from in the middle of the page to the top of the list is seeing a difference the gift can make, the impact of the gift. And so I'll just tell you, this is something you have to figure out, that whether it's through empirical evidence or whether it's through stories and anecdotes and case studies, charities have got to figure out, how do you convey that message? What is the impact of the gift? Because it's no longer going to be valid to at least some donors to say, keep giving your $100 gift, your $1,000, your $1 million gift to us every year. Donors want to see impact, and if not, they are going to be one and done.
That's one of the challenges, I think, to all of us in the nonprofit world, to keep changing the report, the story, to have testimonials, to talk firsthand about what it is that one's charitable dollars are doing, not just going into a black hole. So the cases for giving need to be more compelling, and they need to be reflecting much more impact. That's what donors are looking for. It's a different conversation today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. It's one of the reasons that even though we saw $400 million in giving to Sandy relief, people could feel that they were really impacting lives. And just imagine if if nonprofits had been better organized in terms of Sandy relief, how that $400 million could have been doubled or tripled. Remember, in 2012, Sandy was the only natural disaster. There was no other disaster that occurred in the United States or across the globe that captured donor attention. Donors did respond across the country. Even people outside the United States gave some dollars for Sandy relief. And I think that we in the nonprofit world are in a period of transition we need in terms of messaging and also using technology better.
Just want to say one thing about that. When you're doing program evaluation, there's two different things you can count. You can count outputs or outcomes. Outputs, I'll use the art and the theater because I'm on the board. Outputs are how many public school kids go to see performances. Outcomes are what happens in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years for children who are exposed to the arts. So it's pretty easy to measure outputs. It's pretty challenging to measure outcomes. So if you're doing short-term impact data for donors, you can really measure outputs, and a lot of donors, that's enough. If you're really looking at thoughtful donors in the long run, they're much more interested in outcomes, which are often longitudinal studies, which are much more difficult, expensive, and require a lot of stick-to-itiveness, but will really tell you the long-term impact. So when you're looking at trying to figure out what you're going to say to donors in response, think of those two and see how easy or difficult it is to gather those data points in your organizations.
So we have time for one more question. There was a lady in the back. Yes.
Thanks. Hi. Question for Patrick. So when the IRS calls and asks you to measure the impact of a potential CAC, do they also ask about the potential offset in terms of the increase in government burden? And I ask because this is a big issue in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular, where government regulators are trying to challenge real estate tax exemptions, and I think not fully appreciating that when you tax the nonprofit's property, they're going to have less money to deliver the charitable services.
Yeah, they didn't ask us that question, but I think it's a valid question. And I think that, Eileen's point about it's a slippery slope and drives a wedge, and our concern is that with pilots and things like that, it also creates a slippery slope. And we say, I get it from particularly the local government perspective of, in a lot of downtown areas, half the buildings are government and the other half are nonprofits. And the for-profits have gone out to the suburbs, right? And so it's a challenge then on a tax-based issue. At the same time, those charities are providing important services, in many cases, offsetting or reducing the need for government funding in important ways. And I think that it's something, that aspect of it is sometimes neglected by the rush to reduce taxes and the rush to offset tax revenue losses from other problems because of the economy. So I think it's maybe a little nuanced, but I think your point's very valid and underappreciated in this discussion.
Okay, so I do want to be mindful of time. We are going to be here, so if you have other questions, feel free to come up and talk to the panelists afterwards, grab a cup of coffee. So final words from the panelists before we break.
Go out and conquer.
I actually want to. I want to thank Patrick. The data that they're producing in the center is, and now a college that it's giving degrees in a formal way, is so valuable to the sector, both domestically and internationally. And I really salute you for being a center for this important data. Because without this big data, that we can speak as a sector much more effectively. So my hat is off to you. Thanks for coming to Philadelphia.
Yeah, again, thank you, Patrick. It's been great.
I'll just make one non-empirical observation, and this is follow-up to your question. I think with respect to the tax code, and so Bob's challenge to us to go out and conquer, but also to raise the awareness of the importance of the nonprofit sector. 10% of the labor force is in the nonprofit sector. It's 5% of the GDP overall when you look at all the sources and of revenue and so on. I think it's important. But when you think about the tax code, one of the things that it says by being a fully deductible item, it says to society, this is important from a moral perspective, it's important from a social perspective, and is important from a tax consequence perspective. People, though, are not giving just because it's tax deductible, right? That's irrational. If you only care about yourself, you wouldn't give a thing because it's just a deduction. But it does affect the statement of intent for it to be a tax deductible good, and so I think it is something that's worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank Dr. Rooney for coming, traveling all this way. Robert Evans, Eileen Heisman, and John Biederman, our illustrious panel of presenters. I'd also like to thank EHL Consulting, the National Philanthropic Trust, Donor Perfect, the foundations of the Union League, as well as the Union League for hosting this event, sponsoring this event, and making it happen. Finally, I'd like to thank Giving USA for all of the wonderful work that they do, and every single one of you for coming out for a very early morning meeting. You guys look wonderful. You guys had great questions, and we hope to see you again next year. So if you want any more information about the presenters that you saw today, we have information packets, collateral materials, things like that on that front table. We'd ask you to please return your name tags. And if you'd like to stick around and mingle and ask some questions, grab a cup of coffee, and we'd welcome you to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Evans.
Madam?